What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today, Monday, August 3rd, the T5S2 Season 1 Invitational Tournament has begun. All the lists are in, and we're currently scheduling games with the players for live streaming on the channel. So today, I'd like to go through an analysis of the lists and the meta for the top 16 of the T5S2 tournament series. The breakdown of the super factions that we have in the top 16 is a little disappointing, but not all that surprising. We have 56.3% Imperium super faction, 31.3% Chaos, and only 12.5% Eldari, with the other Xenos factions entirely unrepresented. Not too surprising, given the big nerfs that a lot of the Xenos factions experienced, not only to their points cost, but also to their playstyle in the new rules. But I would have liked to see them have some game. However, it does seem like Chaos or Imperium is the way to go if you want to compete at the highest level in this current meta. Now, looking at the sub-faction representation, those super factions do look pretty bad, but once we remember the number of sub-factions included in both Chaos and Imperium, it's not all that surprising, and we actually have a pretty diverse group of sub-factions in there. The two Eldari players in the tournament are split evenly down between Harlequins and Standard Craft Worlds. We have 3 Adeptus Astartes players in the event, as well as a Space Wolves and Grey Knights and Astra Militarum, 2 Adeptus Sororitas, as well as 1 Adeptus Mechanicus as well. So even though the Imperium is a dominating section of that meta, we do have a pretty wide swath of different Imperium sub-factions making their appearance. Over on the Chaos side, things are a little bit more interesting, with almost every Chaos list bringing a Chaos Demons detachment, giving them the biggest meta percentage out of any of the sub-factions. We also have 2 lists bringing Thousand Suns detachment, 1 Chaos Space Marine list running pure Chaos Space Marines actually in the Creations of Bile sub-faction, which I think is awesome, as well as Phil Barfoot, aka Cryogen, coming in with his patented triple Lords of Skulls, alongside some demons to bump up those Chaos Space Marine numbers. Overall, while I am disappointed at the lack of Xenos representation, I think that this striation of sub-factions is very interesting, and especially the Chaos lists gravitating towards a combination of demons and some variety of Chaos Space Marine is a lot like it was in 8th edition, but I think Chaos Demons give the Chaos Super faction some interesting tools, especially when it comes to taking board space and holding down those objectives in the center of the table. Now covering some lists in specific, and you can find all of these lists over at tts40k.com/invitational, so you can follow along with me, but I was just talking about those Chaos lists, and I would like to cover some specifics. Interestingly, Arn Azert from the Hottest Takes team and Daniel Kennedy both registered the exact same Chaos Super faction list, a soup of Thousand Suns as well as Chaos Demons. The list brings in a Chaos Demon battalion with a full 6 Nurgling squads, 3 units of 9 as well as 3 units of 5, alongside a Lord of Change, souped up to be as difficult to kill as possible with that Exalted Stratagem as well as the Impossible Robe, and a Sloppity Bile Piper to buff up all those Nurglings for cheap points. We also have a Supreme Command detachment from Thousand Suns bringing the Magnus the Red. The reason for that is that in this tournament, we have not yet received any clarification on the questions pertaining to the core rulebook, and as such, currently, by the wording of the rules, you can cast the Smite Psychic Power multiple times with the same character every turn. So Magnus Red becomes an absolute insane powerhouse, despite the fact that he is a little bit easier to kill, given that a lot of the terrain will not block line of sight to him because he has 18 wounds. That said, he can jump up the table, cast 3 smites to do 3d6 or more mortal wounds, then use the stratagem to cast an additional Psychic Power and warp time himself out of there back to safety every turn. These lists also bring a patrol detachment from Thousand Suns as well to get a couple extra casters in there, including Ahriman and a sorcerer in Terminator armor, who it looks like will be bringing that devastating sorcery warlord trait to deal an additional mortal wound with all of these damaging psychic powers that he casts. We also have a unit of cultists to fill out that patrol detachment. But overall, pretty straightforward. The Nurgling Swarms are going to be insanely powerful in 9th edition, and I think already we're seeing a lot of Chaos lists gravitating towards bringing as many Nurgling Swarms as possible. The reasons for that obviously being that they are relatively inexpensive. Because they can't perform actions, they didn't get much of a points increase between 8th and 9th edition. They can forward deploy onto the center objectives to stop your opponent from being able to control them early, and they can just sit there and be very difficult to kill. That said, we are seeing a lot of high-volume multi-damage weapons coming into the meta, and those are perfectly suited to take out Nurglings because they do ignore the Nurglings 5+ ignore that they would normally get against damage 1. So it may be that these Nurgling Swarms go down pretty quickly, but with 3 units of 9 that you could potentially Warp Surge, I think they will stick around for a little while. That is a ton of wounds to chew through with a 5+ invulnerable save, even if you are just hitting and winning on 2s every time. Going over some of the other Chaos archetypes in the tournament, Malchahofs, aka Wolfon Mibu, is bringing a pure Chaos Space Marine list that actually looks like something right out of 8th edition. He's bringing an Iron Wars detachment with 3 units of cultists, 2 Lords Discordant, as well as a Master of Possession. That's to buff up the 3 units of Obliterators. These guys have Mark of Khorne on them. Interestingly, not Mark of Tzeentch, or interestingly, not Mark of Slash for that Endless Cacophony. But I imagine that that is to combo with the Crimson Crown. So basically, we're going to be running a similar combo to the old Lord of Skulls list with the triple Lords of Skulls. This time, just banking it off 3 Obliterators. That combo is to use the Demon Smith Warlord trait on the Master of Possession to allow all of those Obliterators to explode 6s to hit. Use the Crimson Crown on the Demon Prince of Chaos so that any Chaos Demon units, which includes the Obliterators, will get an additional attack on a 6 to wound. And you're just going to basically double dip on all of those attacks and just deal an immense amount of damage with those big flesh metal guns. We also, again, have a bunch of Nurglings in this list. Looks like a total of 10 bases of Nurglings to take those front objectives and fill out the troops allotment for this Chaos Demons patrol here. Pretty interesting list, pretty one-dimensional. You do have the Lords Discordant who can come in and try to late game a little bit, but they did get an enormous points increase going from 8th to 9th edition, so they are slightly less efficient, although I think a lot of the things that they're good at killing may be running up into the middle of the table, so they may have a lot of easy targets that they'll be able to take out. But anything that Obliterators can reliably kill, which is most things in the game because they are high volume, fairly reasonable shots, is going to melt to 9 of these things. They're going to put out an immense amount of damage. The Master of Possession also brings in some additional support in Cursed Earth and Infernal Power, so he can bring those Obliterators down to a 4+ invulnerable save and reroll 1s to hit. Again, the same combo that we saw in the Lords of Skulls list that was really tearing it up on the scene at the end, the tail end of 8th edition. Speaking of which, we do have that list making its appearance, run by Phil Barfoot here, bringing those 3 Iron Warriors Lords of Skulls. Looks like they didn't get too much of a points increase going from 8th to 9th, so they are going to be still relatively efficient. We have the Demon Prince of Chaos in a Chaos Patrol detachment, again, with a bunch of Nurglings, this time 13 Nurgling bases, as well as a Patrol detachment from Iron Warriors, excuse me, as well as a Nurgle Patrol detachment to bring in a Master of Possession, as well as another unit of Nurglings. So this time, we have basically replaced all of the infantry in this list with Nurgling swarms, and we're just going to be focusing on keeping the enemy screened out from those, the immense damage output of those Lords of Skulls. It's going to be interesting to see if this list, how well this list survived. One issue of it is that it doesn't spread out across multiple objectives very well, but it will be able to kill basically all of your opponent's models that stand out in the open. So it may just be able to shoot its opponent off of objectives and slowly, you know, score 10 points every turn for holding 2. The list did lose a lot of its late game punch. It did lose its Lord Discordant and a lot of the infantry that it would use to score secondary objectives and just generally get in the way. It did replace those with those Nurgling swarms, which I think will be useful. But it's going to be interesting to see this list on the table and how well it made the transition between 8th and 9th. Last but not least, we have an insanely cool list coming out of Denith from the Normal Blokes team. This is a pure Chaos Space Marine list entirely from the Creations of Bile Legion that was released in Psychic Awakening right at the end of 8th edition. We didn't really get a chance to see Creations of Bile hit the table super hard, and I think they got pushed out by some of the hyper-efficient contenders in the meta at that stage, but it's going to be awesome to see them on the table now, and I'm super psyched. This list is totally off the wall, and I'm so excited about it. First up, it's bringing an Exalted Champion as well as Fabius Bile to bring the Warlord and give everyone that Legion trait in its first patrol, and it's bringing up those troop choices with a unit of Chaos Space Marines. Then following up with 2 units of 20 Possessed, the full sort of maximum Possessed bomb, as well as 2 units of Havocs, both with 4 las cannons to bring some anti-tank into the game. We also have a second patrol detachment bringing a Master of Possession and a Sorcerer, not too surprising there, a second unit of Chaos Space Marines, and, get ready for this, 20 more Possessed. We've spent 1,200 points on bringing Possessed to the table, which is super awesome. We have that Sorcerer coming in with Prescience and Warp Time to buff those guys up. The Master of Possession, obviously, can increase their invulnerable save to 4+, as well as give a little bit more reliability to the random attacks on those Possessed with that mutated Invigoration psychic power. Now, the reason that we're bringing these guys in Creations of Bile is that they're able to, I guess, stem the bleeding a little little bit of losing the Demonkin Ritualist attachment by giving all of these possessed +1 movement and strength. Creations of Bile also gives access to the Macrotensile Sinews stratagem to allow those possessed to advance and charge and get +1 to their advance and charge roll as well, making them pretty lethal, especially with warp time on the table, where they could potentially be advancing with that +1 twice before getting a +1 charge. And with the relatively quick base speed of 7, they can actually be pounding across the table pretty quickly. You also get a couple other abilities that can make big max units of possessed very difficult to deal with, including Venomous Claws to basically give them a Gene Rot Might equivalent effect, as well as Monstrous Visage to give them -1 to be hit within 6 inches. So a couple interesting combos coming out of this list, and mostly just putting 60 possessed on the table and asking your opponent if they can deal with it, which I think a lot of lists may not be able to, although like I mentioned that there is a lot of high volume multi-damage shooting coming into the meta right now, and so it may be pretty well situated to kill a list similar to this. This is definitely one of the most interesting lists in the event, I think, and I am interested to see how Denith does with it. Obviously, the types of units brought in the list are a little bit awkward currently. With the new coherency rules and the new melee rules, it is harder than ever to get big units of 20 melee infantry all fighting at once, but typically you want to be stringing those guys back to their support characters anyway, and with less volume on the table, it may be a lot easier to do that stringing, even with the new coherency rules in play. So I am interested to see how Denith does with this list. I think it's definitely one of the most interesting lists in the event so far, and I'm psyched to see it on the table. Next up, let's go through the Eldari list that made the cut before moving on to the Imperium stuff. First off, we have Colin Burns, obviously a grinder throughout the entirety of the first season of T5S2, playing in tons of tournaments and racking up a bunch of wins to his name, both with Eldari and with Raptors in 8th edition. But today we are bringing the Eldar out, and it's going to be an interesting take on essentially a mechanized Eldar list from the end of 8th edition moving into 9th. This one's bringing a full 3 units of Hornets, 6 of them, all with pulse lasers. We also have 3 max units of support weapon platforms with vibro cannons. Obviously, incredibly efficient shooting with expert crafters, and now that they can move and shoot without penalty thanks to not being infantry, they're actually going to be a lot more mobile than they were in 8th edition, because a lot of times they would hamstring their own damage output. That said, the vibro cannon rule has not yet been updated to my knowledge, and so they do cap themselves at +1 to wound, which is a little bit awkward, but typically with the high volume of shots that they're putting out, that's not that big of an issue. We're also bringing 3 Warwalkers as well as 2 Falcons, so really moving the focus of the list from the big heavy tanks like Night Spinners and Fire Prisms to these lighter, faster tanks. And again, we do have a high volume of multi-damage shooting in here. Vibro cannons all bringing in D3 2 damage shots, as well as the Star Cannons also bringing in their D3 damage shots as well. Really looking to kill sort of intercessor equivalent models, I think, with a lot of this mid-range shooting. But obviously, there are 2 Farseers in here who can, with the access to Jinx and Doom, can make all of those middling strength shots really punch through heavy armor very easily too. So far, an interesting list. I do like that Eldari is still in the meta. It is a little awkward that sort of the Eldari archetype has remained the same from 8th to 9th edition, because I don't think a lot of people really enjoy it, but I do think it is a powerful list. And in our faction rankings video, we did talk about how powerful Eldari are going to be in 8th edition, given that they have so much highly efficient shooting. Next up, we have Liam Vessel's list from WTC Team Belgium, and he is bringing entirely Harlequins. I actually super love this. It's going to be sick to see the Harlequins on the table in 9th edition. I think a lot of people don't really know where to put Harlequins in the power level right now. I think we put them mid-tier in our power rankings on the channel. But Liam has really kitted out his list to basically just sweep everything that sits in the center of the table and really dominate that middle area with his Harlequin troops. They are fairly easy to take out, but he does have a couple tricks in here that's going to make it a little easier for him to hold objectives than it normally would be, just bringing standard Harlequins to the table. This whole list is being built out of a single battalion, so that's going to make him very efficient on CP. He's going to come in with the full 12, which means that he can combo off a lot of use a lot of the new Harlequin stratagems to combo off pretty well. He's bringing a Shadow Seer as well as a Troopmaster and the Incarn. The Incarn, obviously an incredibly powerful model, and I think one of those tools that he's going to be able to use to hold on to objectives that normally you would be shot off of. For example, you can put a Harlequin troop onto an objective, and even if your opponent kills that Harlequin troop, you're going to be able to put the Incarn there, and they're going to have an entirely new threat to deal with before you actually lose that objective. It's basically the same rationale behind having dedicated transports, which this list does do. It has 3 Star Weavers in the list for 3 3 units of Harlequin troops. So you could potentially have a 5-man Harlequin troop into a Starweaver. They have to kill the Starweaver, then kill the Harlequin troop, then kill the Incarn, and all do that sort of hyper efficiently and have shots to spare. And I think a lot of lists may just not be able to do that, which will allow this list, while it will lose those small units pretty quickly, it will, I think, give them a little bit of an opportunity to take the center of the center of the table. We're also bringing 2 10-player Harlequin troops with a bunch of Harlequin's Caresses in there to really fight fight it out in the center. All of those guys are going to get +1 attack on the charge, staying through the Frozen Stars mask form, which means that we're going to be doing massive amounts of damage. They also have access to the +1 to wound stratagem, which will carry on through their War Dance if they decide to fight twice. That is only +1 to wound against, I think it's infantry bikers. So they can kill, again, sort of intercessor equivalents super well. Once they fight into some heavier armor, it's going to be a little bit tough to take those guys out. Hopefully the Incarn can sort of shore up the matchup there. We don't have any fusion boats, which is a little bit surprising to me. We do have fusion pistols on a lot of these Harlequin troops, but none of them are 5 fusion pistol troops. I think mostly just going to be basically trying to deliver that single fusion pistol shot, which is fair. We also have 3 Death Jesters in the list, which allows Liam to run through all 3 of the pivotal roles for the Death Jester, which I think is awesome. Those Death Jesters are incredibly powerful support units, and having access to all of those different pivotal roles, I think, is going to be very useful, as well as 2 units of Skyweavers with Haywire Cannons and Zephyr Glaives. So the expensive version of the Skyweavers, not picking or choosing one of their roles, are going to be doing both of them. The Haywire Cannons obviously will give the list a little bit of an out against tanks. That said, I think monsters may be potentially a problem for this list. Obviously, none of their damage buffs really work against them. You can give +1 damage and full rerolls with the Troopmaster to the standard Harlequin troops, but they are still probably just fishing for 6s, 5s or 6s, which is a little bit awkward. But again, these Skyweavers are going to be super fast. And, they have access to that Twilight Pathways to allow them to double move, if assuming they're going first, and really hammer their opponent and try to take out some important stuff and tie everything up to allow the rest of this army to take those center objectives early. It is going to be a little bit squishy, but I think Liam will probably be able to utilize the new Harlequin stratagems to not only buff that Shadowsteer aura, so it could potentially, with the new pivotal role, affect the Skyweavers as well with -1 strength, and potentially give them +1 armor save even. And I should mention as well that the Harlequin update at the end of 8th edition gave them a lot of additional tools that they can use to fight into some devastating gun lines that normally you wouldn't be able to. For example, with all of these Harlequin troop units on the table, they can use the stratagem to consolidate to a unit that's falling back from them, which makes especially a 10-man Harlequin troop very difficult to disengage from, because just leaving combat will allow them to engage more stuff in your army. And even though a lot of things can shoot into melee now, that means that that's a lot of shots that aren't going, again, at those Starweavers that are going to be actually sitting on the objectives and ranking up points. Not to mention that this list is excellent at scoring sort of the board control secondary objectives, which is always something that's very important to do. I really can't imagine a game where this list doesn't, maximize engage on all fronts or line breaker or something like that. I am excited to see Harlequins on the table for sure, and I think they do make for some of the most exciting games, as we've seen in 8th edition in the T5S2 series, and I am really psyched to see them take the table in the Invitational in 9th Ed. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the big baddie in the room, the Imperium super faction lists. And we have, like I mentioned before, a wide variety of lists in this super faction. Starting it off with Dan Paolini, the #1 seed going into the Invitational, the top placer in the T5S2 series, the #1 going in, and we'll see if he can close it out with a win in the Invitational as well. He's bringing Salamanders, and Dan and Nick Rose, I think, actually playtested together and have brought two very similar lists to the Invitational, just a couple points off. So I'll just be covering Dan's version of it this time around. But he's bringing a battalion detachment from the Salamanders chapter. I think one of the sleeper chapters in 8th edition that not a lot of people wrote off because they weren't quite as flashy as some of the other ones. They were a little bit more banal, but a lot of their buffs are extremely powerful. They're very good defensively, not to mention the fact that they get free access to extra crafters or master artisans so that they can get that single reroll. And as for moving into the new Eradicator meta, getting +1 to wound on those Eradicators in 2 turns of the game is going to be a big freaking deal. So this list is bringing in an Inquisitor for some psychic support, as well as a Primaris Chaplain, a Captain on bike with the Salamander Mantle to make him very difficult to kill. Not quite impossible to kill, but we're going to be trying our hardest to keep him alive. He does have Forge Master for that +2 toughness, putting him up to a respectable toughness 7. 7 with -1 to be wounded. Pretty strong. We also have a Primaris Chaplain in there and a Lieutenant from Indomitus. We have an Assault Intercessor squad, an Incursor squad, an Intercessor squad, and 2 tactical squads. I think the variety in Space Marine troop options that is coming out of these lists is very interesting. We see a lot of these lists bringing a wide variety, especially of these Primaris infantry, to sort of cover a lot of different roles, which I think is very cool. Obviously, having some of those forward deploy Incursor squads is very important, especially if you're trying to, for example, set banners on center objectives or something like that. Being able to forward deploy and immediately move on to the objectives is very powerful. And then having a mix of Assault Intercessors and Standard Intercessors gives you the ability to engage in multiple phases of the game. We also have a 5-man Aggressor squad with auto Boltstorm Gauntlets. That's going to be using the Steady Advance stratagem to count those guys as stationary and allow them to double shoot their Boltstorm Gauntlets. Not to mention that having access to a +1 to wound stratagem is excellent on a high volume unit like that. And Salamanders are going to be trying to stay in Tactical Doctrine as long as possible, so they're going to be able to get that +1 AP on all of those Strength 4 shots as long as they can. We also have a bunch of land speeders, and this is an interesting development that's coming into 9th edition. A lot of the land speeders didn't really change their points very much, and they all got the ability to move and shoot without penalty. Not to mention the fact that it sort of creates an MSU style of list, which is exactly what Salamanders want to play, given that they have that Master Artisans reroll on every individual unit. So that said, we have 2 Javelin attack speeders, which is a Relic Forge World model that actually sort of trends towards survivability rather than just regular, being fast and cheap like a lot of the other land speeder varieties. This one is toughness 6. It has 9 wounds, as well as a rule that gives it -1 to be hit from outside of 8 inches. With those big las cannons that Dan's putting on them, they're going to be able to play sort of as a backline unit and just be incredibly difficult to deal with. He does have to take 2 of those servitor units to unlock them, but now that there's no, not really any benefit to killing more outside of the grind them down secondary objective, having those random servitor units on the table isn't really that big of a downside for you. They're going to be able to sit in back objectives and just hang out and, chill for a while. We also have 2 units of Landspeeder Tempests, which have really been sort of taking the game by storm. They have, in addition to an assault cannon, they have a multi-shot blast missile launch. That's strength 6 and 2 flat damage with a big -3 AP modifier on it, as well as a standard Landspeeder coming in this list. So this Landspeeder Tempests, I think we're going to be seeing them a lot, and we're already starting to see them sort of creep into a wide variety of lists. Landspeeder with a multi-melta to take advantage of that +1 to wound from being Salamanders, and then that said, we also have 2 Eradicator squads, all with those Melta rifles, which, again, will benefit from that +1 to wound in Tactical Doctrine. Overall, a very interesting list. I think this style of list plays into the various strengths of Salamanders. Salamanders have always been in a little bit of an interesting place, given that they can buff large units well with their Crucible of Battle and their defensive buffs, but they also, that that Master Artisans sort of encourages them to take an MSU style, and I think this list and this style of list really helps that out. You have that big unit of aggressors that you can dump those defensive stratagems on, and then on top of that, you have a lot of small units of land speeders that are going to make maximum use from that Master Artisans reroll. Keeping on that Space Marine train, we'll talk about Paul Junson's White Scars. Paul Junson, a.k.a. Glarg, the winner of the very first T5S2 tournament way back in April, I think is when it was. But super excited to see Glarg make it to the top 16, and he was able to scrape by right at the end there with a couple strong placements at the end of 8th edition to squeak right into the top 16 and qualify for the Invitational. And I'm psyched to see him on the table with this interesting White Scars list that's really diving into a lot of the new Space Marine releases from Indomitus. This list is bringing a Chaplain for that delicious strike off the head, as well as Wise Orator, which is one of the only ways that you can actually reroll litanies after the change to command reroll. We also have Corsaro Khan in there for an additional +1 to wound on everything within 6 inches of the charged. Very powerful. We have a big 7-man Intercessor squad, as well as 2 Infiltrator squads. Again, an interesting combination of the 2 varieties of the different varieties. Primaris infantry. I think a lot of lists are taking sort of a combination of the forward deployers and the standard intercessors. A big, huge elites group. We have a unit of 6 aggressors, as well as a 3 Blade Guard veteran squads, with their new 4+ vulnerable save storm shields, and those 6 sick 2+ armor saves with that new storm shield roll. We're also bringing a couple characters in alongside them. We're bringing a Judiciary, as well as a Primaris Ancient. In fast attack, we have 3 Outrider squads with 3 members each, as well as 2 Eradicator squads, which I think are pretty standard. The Eradicator squads, you maybe see an encirclement from them, although I think you may be able to do it a little bit more efficiently with the standard strategic reserve stratagem. I'm not 100% sure. But overall, I think a very interesting list coming from Glarg. The 3 Outrider squads can really project a lot of force as well, alongside the Infiltrator squads in the early game and keep your opponent hemmed in, while they do pretty reasonable damage once you get to that Assault Doctrine. They are AP2 with 2 flat damage, which is pretty reasonable. And then you have these 2 big boats of 7 Assault Intercessors as well as 6 Aggressors, both running up the table with those 3 Vanguard or Blade Guard veteran squads. Really just going to be dominating the middle of the table, advancing and charging, and foot flogging your way up as quickly as possible. I think a lot of White Scars lists are trying to play with the Impulsor builds still, but Impulsors I think lost so much efficiency and look like they may be getting an additional nerf with the new Space Marine book that I think a lot of people may be trying to build them out of their lists, and I think this list from Paul here is a very interesting take on White Scars. I am excited to see this melee style of Space Marines hit the table, and I am rooting for them. And speaking of this 8th edition style of Impulsor Space Marine, let's talk about Jamie Paris's Space Wolves. Seeing pure Space Wolves hit the table in the top 16 of the Invitational, I think, is absolutely awesome, and hoping Jamie Paris can make it far with these guys. He's bringing a single battalion detachment with Ragnar Blackmane and a Wolf Lord in Phobos armor. I wonder if that guy's going to be trying to suit up with some Armor of Rust in there. Also bringing 2 Intercessor squads as well as an Incursor squad. Again, pretty even distribution between different varieties of Primaris infantry. Also bringing 2 Blade Guard veteran squads and a Judiciary in the elite slots, but taking a little bit more of a ranged approach with 2 Relic Contemptor Dreadnoughts. I think a lot of people are moving a lot of their fire base to the Relic Contemptor platform because it is very points efficient, and now that they can move and shoot without penalty, that helps them a lot as well. Not to mention the fact that they are eligible for Duty Eternal, so they can reduce incoming damage on them, and that makes them very difficult to beat in a trade-off because you do have way more CP than you did in 8th edition with a similar style of list, so that Duty Eternal almost feels free, to be honest. And getting on a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought that has an invulnerable save and has that -1 damage on it can be very difficult to take down in a straight-up gunfight. We're also, again, we're bringing through Landspeeder Tempests, again, talking about how great the Tempest is right now. Very efficient gun platform, and bringing those blast multi-damage shots is exactly what you want to be doing to knock out some Primaris infantry. Then we also, like I mentioned before, we have 3 Impulsors with shield domes to carry around. Probably, I imagine some of those Intercessors go in them, and then also the Blade Guard veterans can fit into an Impulsor as well. So you could be fitting an Intercessor squad as well as the Judiciary in one Impulsor and 2 Blade Guard veteran squads in the other Impulsor to just ram them down your opponent's throat, get the use of all of those Space Wolf combat benefits. Not to mention Ragnar Blackmane and the Phobos Wolf Lord can be up in there as well. Phobos Wolf Lord can join the Incursors for deploying and give some access to rerolls for those frontline units. So basically trying to create space with those Impulsors moving up the table, taking the center objectives between them and the Relic Contemptors, which are fully kitted out with Cyclone missile launchers and are going to be able to put out an immense amount of damage, especially against armored targets. And then you can clean out, your opponent's chaff infantry or whatever with your bolters and with just melee attacks from all these powerful infantry. But I think those 2 Relic Contemptors and the 3 Landspeeder Tempests are going to be where a lot of your damage comes from, and the rest of it is basically just going to be throwing onto objectives and really trying to fight your opponent in the middle of the table. I think an interesting take on Space Wolves. A lot of people kind of wrote them off once the points increases hit them so hard. And I think a lot of the builds from 8th edition where you're focusing a specialist infantry like Wolfen or Thunderwolf Cavalry or something like that are probably a little bit less efficient now until we see a new book come out for them. But I do like that Jamie is pushing into a new direction with Space Wolves in this combined arm style that's, again, using a lot of the new releases from Indominus. Moving off of the Space Marine train, I'm going to talk about some of the most interesting other lists that we have from the Invitational for the Imperium super faction. We'll start with Tomb King 20, who was able to qualify using Chaos Knights for the most part, or a combined Chaos list that was focusing on a bunch of Knights, but unfortunately Knights are not quite as powerful in the 9th edition meta so far, and moving over to Talarn Astra Militarum, which I think is super cool. Talarn, a little bit of an interesting place right now. They obviously don't really, you don't get the benefit from ignoring moving and shooting on your vehicles anymore. You can still advance and shoot your infantry, but I think the big thing for Talarn is the access to that get around behind them special order for the tanks so that they're able to move and shoot. And especially if you're planning on taking second player in a lot of the T5S2 maps, the way that the Invitational works is that it's going to use sort of the 8th edition style of deployment where the attacker will deploy their whole army, then take the first turn, and the defender will deploy their whole army after the attacker deploys. But the defender gets to pick their deployment zone, and the deployment zones are fairly skewed in the T5S2 maps to favor one side or another, especially with a lot of area terrain. And what Tomb King 20 is going to be able to use that for is to tow into that obscuring area terrain with his tank commanders and fire them, then use that get around behind them to just tuck back outside. And I think that's going to be an incredibly powerful shooting base that not a lot of people are going to be able to easily deal with. There's not a lot of indirect fire in these lists, and especially the indirect fire that can actually hold a candle to tank commanders. We're not really seeing a lot of sort of basilisk equivalents or whirlwind scorpii. There's no hive guard in here, and these tank commanders are going to be able to sort of do their scoot and shoot pretty much with impunity. The question is whether or not that gives Tomb King the forward presence enough to take the center of the table, but I do think the rest of his army is going to be able to do that for him. So he does have 3 tank commanders, all with Demolisher siege cannons, a very powerful gun type now that the board is much smaller and focuses on that aggressive play. The 24-inch range in that gun was a really big downside for the tank commanders in 8th edition, but now it's not that big of a deal. They also have plasma cannons as well as las cannons, and interestingly track guards, which I think is really cool. An interesting include, not one that everybody would immediately pick up on, but it does allow those tank commanders to degrade and remain at their top movement profile, which means in the late game, they're going to be able to use that get around behind them to really run up the table as fast as possible and grab objectives as soon as their opponent is sort of out of the beef to deal with them. I think this is actually a really heads-up play on Tomb King 20. I'm excited to see that little upgrade do some good work for him. We also have 4 infantry squads to make up the troops allotment, as well as 2 astropaths to buff up those tank commanders with their psychic powers. 3 scout sentinels, which I love the inclusion of, especially with these heavy flamers. So scout sentinels are going to get to use go recon to pregame move and really push your opponent back off the center of the table. You don't really want to be taking those heavy flamer shots on your forward infantry if you can help it. We also have 2 Earthshaker carriage batteries. Again, I said no really basilisk equivalent artillery except in this list. In this list, we have 2 Earthshaker cannons that are going to be sitting in the back. A little bit less survivable on those Earthshaker carriages, but I don't think that's quite as big of a deal. If, again, you're planning to go second and just stick those guys behind some obscuring terrain, they're going to be fairly difficult to draw line of sight to, and can, again, just keep shooting and force your opponent out of cover where those tank commanders can light them up. We also have 2 Wyverns. So all the artillery coming out in this game, big old tank list. Wyverns obviously do an immense amount of damage, especially against massed infantry with that new blast rule. Not going to be quite as exciting on a lot of the lists that we've seen so far. I don't think almost any of them have more than 10 models in any of their units, but just in case they do, the Wyverns are there to fight them up. Then to carry around those infantry squads, we have 4 Chimeras, all of them bringing double heavy flamers, 3 of them bringing track guards as well to keep that mobility up. And this is where Tomb King 20 is going to get his objective holding power. Those Chimeras, not the easiest thing in the world to kill, and especially at only 100 points, you don't really want to be sinking shots into them if you don't have to, because they're just not really that efficient to shoot at. Usually take a lot more points to kill than they're worth. And with those heavy flamers, they're going to be able to clear off a lot of infantry in the center. Even when you kill the Chimera, it's going to pile out 10 Imperial Guardsmen onto that objective to obsec it, and it's just going to be a difficult sort of package to deal with, especially while you're getting hammered by these 3 tank commanders, as well as these 2 Earthshakers sitting in the back. I think this is a really interesting archetype of list, and I hope that this is a list that is the direction that Astra Militarum goes in the future, because I think it's really cool. Just this big tank line, just big old armored bodies that's able to put out an immense amount of damage and shooting, on top of being able to force a bunch of mechanized infantry down your opponent's throat. It's going to be very difficult to deal with. I'm interested to see how this artillery package works out. I'm not sure that those Wyverns will have the infantry types that they want to shoot at in the meta so much, but I mean, certainly for 270 points for that many shots, you can't really go wrong, and there is a lot of Nurglings at the table that they're going to be able to deal a lot of damage to, so we'll see how those guys play out. We do have one Adeptus Mechanicus list coming from Jack Tite in the Invitational. Not a lot to say here, to be honest. Adeptus Mechanicus, I think, is still basically in the same mindset that they were at the end of 8th edition, where they're just going to put a lot of sort of highly efficient armor on the table and shoot you to death. So this list looks like very much like a list out of 8th edition. It is building off only a single battalion detachment, and it's coming from Mars. It's not coming from Styges, which I think is interesting, but that does unlock, especially with the new FAQ, it unlocks access to the Mars Canticle, which is extremely powerful and should not be underestimated. It also gives you access, obviously, to Belisarius Call, who is in the list, who's going to be doing a lot of damage, bringing 3 Skitarii Vanguard units to fill that troops allotment, and then focusing the rest of the list on damage dealers. We have 5 Iron Strider Ballistarius to take advantage of that +1 to wound strat, as well as the +2 to hit, potentially. They're highly mobile and can dodge around the back line of the table and really deal a ton of damage with those autocannons. We also have a unit of 10 Terexii Skystalkers to come in, use that Wrath of Mars stratagem on the really super high volume Fleshhead Carbines. The same thing with the unit of Cerberus Raiders that can push up the table early and take center objectives and really force your opponent back, especially with how hard they are to charge into with their stratagem to fall back after they are declared as a charge target. They can really sort of play around the center of the table, and your opponent just has to dedicate shooting to kill them, which is not really what you want to be doing against an Adeptus Mechanicus list, bringing the amount of armor that this one does. We have 2 Scorpius Dune Riders. I think one of them is probably going to be earmarked to bring these 2 Skitarii Vanguard squads with plasma calivers to be able to deliver those plasma shots on target. The other one, a lot of times we see the Terexii go into a Dune Rider because unlike a lot of jump infantry, they can go into transports. Those Terexii also have the option of deep striking innately, obviously. I think it depends on the matchup, what you want to do with those, but typically I think we'll see those in a Dune Rider. And then we have 2 Archaeopter Fusilavs, so the bomber version with 4 heavy stubbers, one bringing a command uplink for that monofilament countermeasures stratagem, which is extremely powerful in some matchups and can really, really screw your opponent over. The other one with the Chaff Launcher, just to be difficult to kill, especially against all of the... We see a lot of like 2 damage and D3 damage shots on the table right now, and the Chaff Launcher, cutting those in half is really powerful. Cutting the amount of damage it takes in half makes it very difficult to kill. But that said, that command uplink I think is really the highlight of that unit. It's going to give the ability to really force through some damage in matchups where you wouldn't normally be able to. Basically a standard Adeptus Mechanicus fare. Nothing much changed between 8th and 9th edition. You just can take less stuff, and as we're seeing, we're basically taking less of the characters and in troops choices that you normally would see in Adeptus Mechanicus. We're going to be focusing more on these Dune Riders, on these Disintegrators, and on these Ballistarius to deal a bunch of damage at shooting. Basically anything that gets caught in line of sight of an Adeptus Mechanicus army is going to get pulled off the table pretty quickly. And I do like to see that we are back to the Belarus Energy Cannon meta for these Disintegrators, because, oh boy, were those Faramite cannons, every time I watched them, entirely underwhelming. But the Energy Cannon, alongside the ability to get +1 strength on it, is going to be really powerful, just to be, especially on the smaller table, since that 36-inch range isn't quite of a downside anymore. It can really rip up basically anything. They have a pretty solid stat line to fight infantry or vehicles, especially with the +1 strength, so very solid. Moving on in no particular order, we'll talk about Matthew Green, aka Headstrong from Team Squad Marks' Grey Knights. Grey Knights are in a bit of an interesting position right now. Obviously, they lost their ignoring of the increased cost of smite, so they aren't able to smite spam in 9th edition. That said, there are some upsides, especially that the smaller table and the more aggressive game means that you have to sort of play into the gun ranges of a lot of Grey Knight armies a lot more often. They have more CP they can spend to buff their guns, which helps a lot, and they can make some very difficult to kill units. It's hard to one-round a unit of Paladins once it has all of its buffs in place, and they can sort of take the center of the table pretty well. We're seeing that in Matt's list here. He's bringing a Brother Captain as well as a Librarian, a 9-man strike squad, all with Stormbolters. I think that's going to be the squad that gets earmarked for Cybolt ammunition to buff up those guns. We also have a Paladin squad with 4 side cannons, as well as a Paladin squad with 4 silencers. Both of them 10-man Paladin squads, and both of them eligible for Psychic Onslaught. Potentially what you could be doing is, if you wanted to use all of your gun buffs in one turn, you could use that strike squad to teleport in, use it for Cybolt ammunition, then Psychic Onslaught one of the Paladin squads, in the Psychic phase, using Edict Imperator to allow it to shoot in the Psychic phase. Then you could potentially, when the second squad goes to shoot in the shooting phase, you could Psychic Onslaught that one as well to get the maximum damage output from your army that you want. That does bleed a ton of CPs very quickly, though, and that is something that Grey Knights do pretty often because they do want to get those extra buffs on the table. But it does allow this army to put out a pretty reasonable damage for 1 or 2 turns before it kind of turns off and it's just shooting at its base level. We're also seeing 2 additional strike squads brought in a second patrol detachment with alongside a Chaplain and Grandmaster Voldus. I do like the inclusion of the Chaplain, although he doesn't have any ability to reroll his litanies anymore. Getting, especially the +1 EP on all of your psi weapons, it can be very powerful, especially if you're playing into one of the many AP ignoring lists that we're going to be seeing in the Invitational. About 25% of the Invitational ignores at least some amount of AP, so being able to buff yourself to AP 2 or 3 is very important. We also have 2 additional strike squads in that detachment, as well as an Apothecary to regenerate some of those Paladins. No Terminators in this list, which is something that I think a lot of lists have been gravitating towards, is putting a lot of Terminators on the table, but we're just going to be basically going back to our Grey Knight roots of putting a bunch of buffs onto some Paladins and shooting them a bunch, and hoping that that's good enough to do. And so we'll see if Matthew Green can do that with any success in the Invitational. Last but certainly not least, we have a couple Adeptus Sororitas representatives in the Invitational, namely Bethany Taylor and Canton, both of whom are bringing lists that look fairly similar from the outside, but actually have some very important differences. Bethany Taylor, for example, is playing entirely Valorous Heart, a single battalion detachment, all from Valorous Heart, which means that she is foregoing the benefit of bringing Bloody Rose, which is, I think, very interesting, and going to be focusing more on the armored vehicles of the faction rather than the infantry that we've seen them do so well with in the past. That said, this list does bring 2 units of Sisters Repentia in. They do significantly less damage in melee, coming from Valorous Heart. They don't have access to that +1 attack ability from Bloody Rose. They also don't have access to the +1 to wound stratagem, both of which are very important now that the way that strength doubling effects has changed in 8th edition, or in 9th edition, to make them only strength 7 rather than strength 8, alongside the Tail of the Warrior. But it is going to give their transports a lot more resilience with that 6+ ignore from the Rhino, with that 6+ ignore and the AP ignoring from Valorous Heart and Tail of the Stoic, moving that to ignoring AP 1 and 2. We also have 3 Battle Sister squads, all with power mauls, which I think is another interesting pick to make them a little bit more threatening in melee. We have 2 Canonesses as well as Celestine. 3 Imagifiers. I imagine one of them is going to be Tail of the Warrior to follow around the Repentia. The other 2 Tail of the Stoic. One probably to sit with the Exorcists, and one to follow around these 3 Immolators that we're seeing in the list as well. So that's going to allow the list to fight a lot of centralized infantry with those big Immolation Flamers, and deliver those power mauls in the Battle Sister squads, potentially. Overall, I think this is a very interesting and a unique take on Sisters of Battle. Normally, we're seeing them played a lot more aggressively, but this is it looks like going to play a little bit more defensively, using that Valorous Heart benefit to stay on the table as long as possible. Canton, also known as Ash Sea or Rentar, we've seen a ton on the streams leading up into the Invitational, is bringing a similar version of the list that she's brought in previous T5S2 events. That being a combination of Valorous Heart for Exorcists and Battle Sisters, and Bloody Rose to buff up those Sisters Repentia. This list is bringing 4 Battle Sister squads and 3 Exorcists in a Valorous Heart detachment, alongside that Imagifier with Tail of the Stoic to babysit those Exorcists. Then, in order of the Bloody Rose, we see a Canoness and a Missionary, as well as 3 units of Sisters Repentia. This is all in a Vanguard detachment, as well as in a Magifier to buff them up with Tail of the Warrior. We also have a Battle Sanctum coming in with a Fortification Network. Fortunately, 0 CP for this detachment, and now that we're not really struggling to fill all of our CPs, or all of our detachment slots in a particular list, it's a lot easier to find spaces for those fortifications. And this Battle Sanctum for 55 points gives you an additional Miracle Die every turn, which is just going to be allow this list to play a lot more efficiently with its Miracle Dice. Not to mention the fact that it gives you access to a large amount of light cover in your deployment zone if you need it as well. So overall, excited to see how this list makes the transition between 8th and 9th edition. I do think that it's going to do pretty well, and I am interested to see how well it does in comparison to Bethany Taylor's list, which is more focused on defensive play, whereas these 3 units of Sisters Repentia are going to be trying to take a ton of table space and really force your opponent back off of objectives. Having played against the triple Sisters Repentia list, I am absolutely terrified of it. I think those 3 units of ladies is excellent at they don't really take the center of the table very well themselves, but you can't really touch any of the Sisters units without being immediately deleted by Sisters Repentia, who just trade up into almost anything in the game so hard, especially with those Bloody Rose abilities. So there we have it, an overview of the lists and the metagame for the T5S2 Season 1 Invitational. If you're watching this on Monday, August 3rd, the day it releases, then we will be starting live streams of these games tonight. 11 p.m. EST is the very first game. We've scheduled a bunch of games throughout the week. So stay tuned on the YouTube channel. Those will all go up publicly, I think, shortly before each live stream goes live. And on tts40k.com/invitational, we'll try to get a streaming schedule live up there as well, so you can tune in as soon as the group stage games go up online. Obviously, on August 13th through 16th, we'll be then playing the top 8. So the top 2 players from each of the 4 groups will qualify for that top 8, and we'll be playing a single elimination event there to crown the eventual winner of the Invitational. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you do decide to tune in for the Invitational live streams. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and we've put a lot of time and effort into making them as high class as possible, so it's going to be a sick time. So come hang out with us, watch some 40K, and remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.